groomer and I'm in a beret. What do we think about that? Part of it's just trying to keep warm. I need a hat on my head to protect my little noggin as I wait for the radiator to heat up. But also, I don't know, I thought doing a book chat, this could lend it a little beatnik coffee house quality, a la So I Married an Axe Murderer. You dig it? We'll try it. We'll run with it. Don't judge me. Anyway, what I'd like to do today is pick up where I left off several months ago. I think it was May, maybe, that I last did a video about the books that I had been reading. And so I just thought, yeah, let's do an update on that. I'm very proud of myself because I feel like I have been reading more in the past year, and to a lot of you it will probably still look like a pathetic accomplishment, but for me, for reasons that I've explained before, I kind of fell off reading. I have, though, in the last year been rediscovering my love of fiction, and I think part of that is due to the fact that I've been making more of an effort to go to the books that have been sitting on my bookshelf, collecting dust, yellowing, literally pages turning yellow because of the years that I've had some of these titles sitting on my bookshelf. And just finally diving into that, because these were titles that I would have picked for myself to read, things that I learned about and sparked my interest, and so chose for myself. I think for a time I fell into a cycle of going along with others' book recommendations, or if they gave me books as a gift, which, not to knock that, because book recommendations in and of themselves are a gift, and books as gifts are wonderful. I've definitely done that. So, my God, I'm kind of giving recommendations here or not. It depends on how I ultimately felt about the book. So obviously I do the same thing too, and I really appreciate it when others do that for me, but I think I was letting that dictate too much what I was reading. And anyways, I'm trying to find my way back to the kinds of books that originally made me tick, and looking back at what past me chose for myself to see what present me thinks about it. And of course, though, in this stack are titles that were recommended to me or gifted to me. So just including all of it. And honestly, this is a random ass collection here. I don't know that it's going to give any insight into what makes me tick entirely, kind of jumping from one thing to another, but it's been fun. And so yes, I will try not to babble on and on and on about each individual one too much for your sake. But I thought, in really picking up very closely to the last video that I had shared on this, starting with nonfiction, I had talked about Journey of Souls and how that blew my ever-loving mind, written by a hypnotherapist who specialized in past life regression, and found that over time he was inadvertently prompting clients to recall memories from their lives between lives. That is, they were remembering dying, their soul leaving the body, and where their soul went after that, and what their soul experienced all the way up until the time that it went into a new body for a new life. So whether you believe in reincarnation or even an afterlife in general, it's a fascinating read. It's amazing food for thought at the very, very least. And so, as I had also mentioned at the time, let me see if I can find it. This is on my old school Kindle here. The follow-up that Michael Newton, PhD, wrote to Journey of Souls is Destiny of Souls. So whereas that first book was presenting what he was learning from clients, following the progression of the soul's journey from death in one life to birth in the next life, this book was written in response to readers' response to that first book, because it does raise a lot of questions. And I'll link my videos below where I first discussed Journey of Souls, as well as a video where I discussed how it prompted me to do some fascinating, at least to me, tarot readings based on the questions that it was raising for me. And tarot was a wonderful tool for trying to find some answers to that. But I was not alone in having a shit ton of questions. And so this is his attempt to answer some of them, providing additional anecdotes and transcripts from his work with clients. So rather than following the soul's progression as Journey of Souls does, this book is structured more along specific subject areas based on the questions that people had. So he groups it that way accordingly. And also very interesting, I haven't finished this. I really just dipped my toe into it because there was so much I was left to contemplate after reading that first one. My head almost hurt from it. It was so expansive for the mind and soul. And I really just kind of wanted to sit with that and savor it a bit longer before going into something like this. So this has been more of a dip in and out of kind of book. And that's a beautiful thing about it. I'm so glad that I basically binge read Journey of Souls because I was just so fascinated. So in a very short time, I was able to like follow that soul's journey. Where this, because it's just divided up by subject area, it's a very easy one to not only dip in and out of, but jump around in based on what you might have more interest in. And I've certainly done that too. You just look at the table of contents and read what you want, maybe even leave what you don't want. So it's set up really well for that. But anyway, after that, kind of staying within the realm of it though, I read Diary of a Death Doula, 25 Lessons the Dying Teach Us About the Afterlife. This is a death doula who is also a medium. So she kind of has this twofold insight into this role. But a death doula, you may be wondering what that is. And I didn't know myself until I had attended death cafes that a friend of mine used to facilitate here in London before she moved back to the States. Death cafes in and of themselves, fascinating thing. I can talk to at more length another time. But in attendance at one of these sessions was a woman who was in training to be a death doula. So that's how I first learned about it. And it sounds like it can really run the gamut as far as what the responsibilities are. And that probably also varies between where you're trained and what organization you're trained through. The UK, as far as I'm aware, only has one centralized organization to get certified for it. So, and I feel like it's a very comprehensive program and your duties would be very comprehensive accordingly. Whereas this author is in the States and the program she went through seemed a little bit more limited in scope. So I think it really depends on where you are and what certification process you go through, and as far as what you're like willing and able to do maybe as well. Because you could do this, I think you can get paid as a doula, but it can also just be a voluntary role. And so again, if you're wondering what a death doula is, if you've heard of a birth doula, which I'm not like super well versed on, but I imagine it's something akin to a midwife. And again, maybe there's like a spectrum of responsibility there, and it would be like a step down from the midwife as far as what you're expected to do. And a death doula is basically at that other end of life. They are assisting with the end of life transition, not from a medical standpoint. They are not hospice doctors or nurses. They don't have that kind of training. But they nonetheless can work in conjunction with hospice. I think that they're a great asset to that, actually, to be able to be there when the other professionals are not able to be, or if loved ones aren't able to be. This kind of support offered can range from sitting at someone's bedside and just holding their hand. Maybe listening to them and talking with them if they are able to do so and wanting to do so, but also being there for the loved ones that might be there and also needing support, maybe just someone to listen to them, maybe someone just to go get them a cup of tea, go get groceries, run errands if, again, the caregivers are so depleted from all they've been having to carry out, and maybe they just are reluctant to leave a dying loved one's bedside. So doulas can make themselves readily available for that. It's at the very least a companionship and a source of support. But they can also get as involved as paperwork, helping people work out their end-of-life plans, maybe making funeral arrangements, sorting out wills, and so forth. So anyways, this doula, she was primarily going to, and still is, I presume, seemed like assisted living facilities, maybe some hospice facilities, where she would go in and consult a list to see who was in need of being visited. And it seemed like the more actively dying were in the most need of that, just while the staff is pulled in different directions. It's someone that can be there until a nurse or a doctor can be. And so a lot of times it seems like she was just checking in on a patient, sitting quietly with them. She said there's lots and lots of hours of just doing that because the patient themselves might not be responsive, especially if they are at that later stage, and especially actively dying. You're not going to sit and have a conversation. But for this woman, I guess I should qualify that because it seems she was able to have active conversations with someone who may have not even been conscious because she could communicate with them through thought. Again, whether you believe this or not, she certainly believes that she had these interactions. And so it was just interesting because she was getting the insight of where they were. Some of them, if they're still in the body or if they are hovering just outside of it and already able to go visit other places. And so they would share their experiences with her. And so she would journal this accordingly. And so this book is the product of this diary that she kept in her first year or so as a death doula. So content-wise, this was very interesting. Ultimately, I was like, when I finished it. I mean, the concept of it does sound so fascinating. I was definitely interested in learning more of what the day-to-day, like mundane tasks would be for a death doula, like the actual role of it. And certainly it's interesting that she can like take it to that other level, as probably most doulas are unable to, in that she has these like psychic abilities. But as a read in and of itself, you know, the writing leaves something to be desired. It's not the most compelling prose, and it can start to feel like a bit like repetitive and actually tedious after a while. So it wasn't the most enjoyable read, but I did read it all. The various anecdotes were interesting. I think the 25 lessons were an attempt at giving it some kind of structure, but I think it really was, for the most part, probably just her diary just published. And maybe to be a more interesting read, it would have benefited from her working in collaboration with a professional ghostwriter, and maybe finding some more structure and elaboration on certain things. It was just kind of like choppy and simplistic in certain ways. And so anyways, I mean, if the topic at all interests you, and especially the fact that she was also a medium, it's not that I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm just, for myself, I'm glad I'm finished with it, and it's going in my donation pile to pass along. What I do have in the wings, though, waiting for me, at the same time I had purchased that, I got this book by Catherine Mannix, With the End in Mind, How to Live and Die Well. And I thought this woman was also speaking from the point of view of a death doula, but let's see. It looks like she does have a medical background. She has spent her medical career working with people who have incurable advanced illnesses, starting in cancer care and changing career to become a pioneer of palliative medicine. She has worked as a palliative care consultant in hospices, hospitals, and in patients' own homes, optimizing quality of life even as death is approaching. This subject matter is something that has interested me ever since I experienced my dad going into hospice, and he was in hospice at home, which left my mom and I as the primary caregivers, though there were hospice nurses that would, pop in and out to check in on us. But witnessing an end of life firsthand over the course of weeks is pretty life-changing. And not just for the fact of if it's your own loved one, all the emotion that and loss that gets bundled in with that, but just that actual observation of a body shutting itself down and seeing what a person's needs are and how they change, if not diminish, towards that end. It really did compel me to just learn more about what their experience is in helping me get perspective on what it is like, I guess, if you're blessed enough to die a natural death and not something accidental where you don't have that time to transition. But it just taught me to recognize the importance of dying well, and how it's not the medical world necessarily that can provide that we do need to rely on a more human approach. So that's just an ongoing topic that I continue to explore. Another nonfiction book that I went through over the past year, all through the past year, in fact, Ancestral Grimoire. I have already shared my experience of the first 6 months working through this book. I will come back with a follow-up on the second half of the year, but Nancy Hendrickson has written quite the interesting book here and set up amazing exercises and approaches to working with your ancestors, which was something I was really curious about and keen to do in a more active and consistent way. And I feel like this has helped me a lot with that. And so now, as that has come to a close, a friend of mine gave me The Book of Ancestors by Claire Goodchild. So I'm very excited to have this as a resource as I hope to continue my ancestor work. I was already feeling kind of nervous because I feel like I needed something like this to basically lead me by the hand through it, because I really didn't know what I was doing. And so I didn't know how, once I was left on my own with it, how exactly I would proceed. And I imagine a part of it is just going to be continuing to pull from the bits from the grimoire that resonated most with me over the last year. But I feel like I'm going to learn new things in this too, and I'm stoked. Really looking forward to reading that. I didn't realize I have my phone here and it was just going off. Sorry, that was my husband, but it actually helped remind me, though, of another nonfiction book that I read, and I had all queued up on here to show because I don't have it here physically, and that is From Here to the Great Unknown by Lisa Marie Presley and Riley Keough. This is a book that my mom made me read while I was visiting her for Thanksgiving. She wanted me to read it and finish it while I was there, so I did. Needless to say, my mother loves Elvis, and that love has gone particularly unbridled ever since my dad passed. But anyway, it was a good read. It was a quick read too. I was able to finish it before I had to leave. But it's heartbreaking too, because Lisa Marie wanted to write an autobiography, and in preparation for it, she had taken voice memos of herself recounting significant times in her life, recalling memories to the best of her ability, talking a lot about her father, of course, and the influence that he had, her strained relationship with her mother, her marriage to Danny Keough and her children from that marriage, and her time with Michael Jackson, and other relationships, and so on and so forth. But she had asked her daughter Riley if she would help her to write this book, because I think she was insecure about her own ability to pull this sort of thing together. And quite sadly, she passed away before they could write this and finish it together. So if you read the book, it is structured with transcripts of Lisa Marie's voice memos, and then Riley's bits where she fills in as she can on her mother's behalf, based on her own experience and what she knew of her mom's memories. And so it's really beautiful how she's able to offer additional insight as Lisa Marie's daughter and Elvis's grandchild. And so the book is written in two fonts accordingly, so you know whose voice is speaking at which time. And yeah, it was a very interesting read. Who am I kidding? I love Elvis too, so my mom didn't really have to twist my arm to get me to read this. But onward to fiction. All right, so in my last book video, I was talking about this mother. What is it? It's like over 600 pages, maybe like 630 or so. The Golden Notebook by Doris Lessing. Okay, if I can find my thoughts with this. So the book is divided into parts that are subdivided into parts, based on these 5 notebooks that the main character maintains for herself. As it says in the summary, Anna is a writer, author of one very successful novel who now keeps 4 notebooks. In one, with a black cover, she reviews the African experience of her earlier years. In a red one, she records her political life, her disillusionment with communism. In a yellow one, she writes a novel in which the heroine relives part of her own experience. And in a blue one, she keeps a personal diary. Finally, in love with an American writer and threatened with insanity, Anna tries to bring the threads of all 4 books together in a golden notebook. So each section begins with what's essentially a novel written in third person about this character, Anna. And then at the end of that portion, you will get a snippet from each of her 4 notebooks. And then in the next part, it will begin again, continuing the novel about Anna, and then the notebooks, and so on and so forth, until you get to the end and you finally get to the Golden Notebook. So the novel about Anna is a bit more, conventionally written with dialogue, and, moves along at a decent enough pace and everything. But then you get these notebooks that are written from Anna's own point of view and are, very different in tone from each other based on what the subject matter is. And it is like getting towards the end where she's trying to like fuse these concepts together. But going into it, I thought this was the coolest premise. I was so excited to get to the Golden Notebook. I did just love the idea of it. And I do just think it's such an accomplishment And Doris Lessing is a brilliant writer, and I had really enjoyed one of her other novels, which was why I had bought this one in the first place. And this is one of my books whose pages is yellowing from sitting probably on my shelf for over 20 years, if I'm honest. But you know, it kept my interest enough maybe for the first 300 pages, and then for the last 300, it was just like a push to just finish it, because I am a completionist. I do not easily walk away from something, whether it's a book or a TV show. It's very rare that I can just like stop and walk away without finishing. So I was determined to finish this because, again, I just really wanted to know what would happen by the time I got to the Golden Notebook. I just thought it was going to be something like mind-blowing and enlightening, and yeah, well, I'll get to that. So anyways, by the end of it, I'm just going to be honest, I hated it. I don't like this book, and this is a very beloved book, and it's taught in schools, and people have done theses on it, and it's just, you know, far be it from me. I couldn't write this. So, I mean, I bowed down to the tremendous undertaking that it was. I mean, from what I've gleaned from like the front and back matter of what Lessing was setting out to do, again, I don't know if if it's for me to say, but I just feel like, in my personal humble opinion, I don't feel like she achieved it. This was written in the 60s. And we've got this divorced woman, single mother, who in many respects can be like looked to as this feminist icon. A lot of people look to this book as a feminist manifesto, but Lessing herself said that's not what she intended it to be. I can see, though, how it can be taken that way, but the character herself just repeatedly, serially sleeps with married men, one after another, after another, after another, which is infuriating. I'm not even coming at it from a moralistic standpoint. I won't even judge on the morality of it. What's infuriating about it is the fact that she knows, for her, it's not healthy. She's had her heart broken in the process. It's not helping to heal these quote unquote relationships that she's having with men are not fulfilling what she is seeking. And so it's just maddening to watch someone continue to make the same poor choices over and over and over again. Like, she just doesn't grow, in my opinion. And I just couldn't stand that. And I just didn't understand, like, why can't she just get involved with someone who's not attached to someone else and doesn't have all this extra baggage, especially when this is like a particular issue with her, as if she thinks that if she tries it again, it'll work out the next time. I mean, it's like, I guess if she thinks she's descending into insanity, I mean, that is insanity, right? When you try the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. So maybe it's part of that, in which case, okay, I guess that suits this character. But I just, the wheel spinning with it and repetition of it, it was just, at the very least, it was really boring. Like, I felt like this book could have been cut in half. It doesn't need to go on and on and on for her, just to showing her having these repeated relationships and taking the notebooks one by one. The black one, which contained her memories of her time in South Africa, that I would say was probably the most interesting one to me. And that could have been a book in and of itself. But that being said, as much as I did enjoy that one, it was also very much written through this very privileged white point of view of a character in a group of privileged white people. And to an extent, it does call out, I mean, it does seem like there's an awareness in looking back at how much they did not really truly understand perhaps the cause that they were championing, and they weren't approaching it in actual constructive ways. But nonetheless, it's still just through that lens. So it just felt very, I hate to throw that word privileged around again, but I don't know. It was just a limiting factor in it. And I think that, you know, that's another book by another writer, perhaps, to feel like, get more of an insight into what was actually happening to the locals in that area versus these young idealistic Brits who went down there to see if they could affect change. And I mean, I guess you could argue maybe it's an authentic experience of a young idealistic Brit at that time, but I don't know. I think coming at it from a 2024 perspective, it was just feeling like a little bit problematic to me in that respect. But anyways, the Red Notebook, where she records her political life. Oh my God. So she was a communist and gradually moves away from that. But that could have been really fascinating. And it was just tedious to read. It was just very mundane because it's like her participation, other than this work that she did do in South Africa, which is relegated to the Black Notebook, there's just like a lot of admin. A lot of admin, a lot of like reading and sending of letters and so forth. And it's just boring. And she does find the disillusionment with it, but it's not, I don't know, it was missing something. I just feel like the whole thing came across like it was from the point of view of sitting in a clerical office, you know, and there were some exciting anecdotes shared like second or third or 10th hand that maybe people would share at their meetings about someone else's experience, but it was dull. And in the Yellow Book, she writes a novel in which the heroine relives part of her own experience. Okay, so this it had potential, and to an extent lived up to the potential of being a really cool concept, where on the one hand, we've got this novel, like I said, that's written about Anna, parts of which begin each section of this overall book. And that's not written by Anna. It is about her by Lessing. But Anna, then, the novel that she is writing, like you see the parallels between her heroine and her own life based on what we're seeing in that other novel. And she can obviously offer extra insight since it's actually her. And even though names are different, circumstances are tweaked to make it fictional, it still essentially started to read like the same story, and it was getting really repetitive in and of itself, and it was feeling really redundant with everything that you read in the objective novel about her. And it just ultimately became tedious for me as well, because it just felt too repetitive and it wasn't enough to talk about to warrant that. It was like barely interesting enough to carry one novel about it, like, so to have to read like a second one about it was just like, ugh. And I feel like that's what all of this was ultimately like devolving down to. Forget the politics in South Africa. Like, so much was just like hinging on her love life with these married men, and it just wasn't, I don't know. In the blue one, she keeps a personal diary. Okay. So again, it's a cool idea because it's like each of these notebooks are these different lenses, right, into the same person. So on the one hand, and for the first 300 pages, what I was really enjoying about this book was the fact that, like, cool, it's like looking at this person through a prism and just taking each of these facets, you know, individually, but like together, they all layer into the whole. And so you think you're going to get this like depth and this texture to it. And to an extent you do. Again, I just feel like once you hit the 300 page mark, diminishing returns, man. I don't think that each book is really adding that much more to what it itself has previously said and to what another book is also saying. It just starts to feel like rehash, repetitive, blah, 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 blah. So at this point then, you're reading a novel written about Anna from an objective point of view, a novel written basically about Anna from her own point of view, and now a personal diary about Anna's life, which she is writing about in her novel, which this novel is about too. It's like, there just wasn't enough to her actual story to keep me interested for this many pages, if you understand what I'm saying. And it's like really, really beating a dead horse by that point to have all these layers. You just feel buried under them instead of them actually offering something new. Again, in my personal humble opinion. And then finally, this effing golden notebook, I probably hated most of all. And I was so disappointed. First and foremost, because again, this is where I said I just didn't think she ultimately achieved what she set out to do. I did not see the Golden Notebook as being this brilliant, enlightening synthesis of all of the other ones. It was just a continuation of Anna's novel about herself, or the one that was written about her, getting involved with not only just another wrong romantic choice, the worst romantic choice that she makes of the book. An absolutely insufferable character. It's got to be one of the worst in literature. Can't stand this guy. Just goes to show she doesn't learn. She is questioning her sanity at this point, and this toxic relationship that she has with this guy is just the absolute worst thing I think that could befall her. And then this guy actually writes his own effing name in her notebook because he wants it. It has this pretty golden cover and he wants it, and he whines like a child for her to give it to him. It's just fucking weird. And he writes his name and says that it's his book. So I just thought that this was going to be like this really meaningful exploration of this woman and finding her own identity, and that there would be an inspiring feminist message behind it. And instead, this Golden Notebook, where I think this grand revelation is going to be found and this grand growth for this character, she's not only not progressing, she's taking 1,000 steps backwards, and then has her Golden Notebook overtaken by this man. I very rarely get angry about something that I've read. I very rarely feel like throwing a book against the wall. That's where I'm at, folks. So I am so sorry if you've read this and absolutely loved it, because it really does seem a lot of people do. And I mean, she's won a Nobel Prize for her work. It does feel like it's not for me to say anything negative about it, but that's my personal reading experience. I hated it. And I think that maybe if it were half as long, and I'm not even saying that there's a problem with having a long book. It's not me being lazy about it, not willing to do it. I am not lazy if I push myself through 300 additional pages of this after losing interest. That's hard work. That was no small feat. So it is definitely not for a lack of trying and willingness to give that kind of time to something. I just want something more to come of it. And I just felt like, again, the diminishing returns, that it wasn't really. So, I mean, it's one of the things that you learn when you are writing your own stories, that you can't keep everything. You have to kill some of your darlings. Everything in a story needs to be there for a reason. And I just felt like it just got so riddled with repetition and redundancy. And again, that lack of forward progression, it didn't need to be in there. And I think a lot could have been cut. So, okay, I really have to stop ranting on that. Moving on to something that was a little bit more engaging for me. I did a video last year when I got back from a visit to Georgia with my family, and we had gone to Tybee Island and bopped into nearby Savannah for a ghost tour and other city explorations. And I went to Bonaventure Cemetery, which is one of the highlights of that trip for me. So then, of course, when I went and toured the Mercer House, I found this in its gift shop, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, a book that I have been meaning to read for so many years now. I've seen the movie with Kevin Spacey and the young Jude Law. Loved the movie, loved the eccentric cast of characters, and I knew it was based on a true story, so there's this. But I actually have this in the fiction pile, as you may have noted already, because it wasn't until after I finished it and did some more diving on the internet that I realized, oh, he fictionalized a lot of this. But it's definitely, I mean, a lot of people that were real. It's not like the murder didn't happen and this court trial didn't happen, but the author's way of recounting the events was quite different. He inserted himself into it more than he was actually involved. He didn't really get into this until after it all had happened. And so in this, it's basically just a character based on him. But it's a mix. I mean, I think blended in there is our actual interactions and approximate conversations that may have been had. But at any rate, fiction or nonfiction, it's still just a fascinating read regardless, and it definitely gets you intrigued by this whole case in general. And I think there is a lot of the actual story of it that's fascinating in and of itself. But, you know, for telling the story of it, it makes for an engaging narrative. So I'm not upset that he approached it the way that he did. I wish I knew myself that that's how it was at the beginning, so that I wouldn't have been reading it and thinking, oh, this is how it happened, this is how it happened. But whatever, I didn't end up being angry and feeling betrayed by the fact that it wasn't entirely nonfiction. Anyway, I devoured this. I loved it. Itty bitty book that I read that was a recommendation from a friend was Grief is the Thing with Feathers. This has got to be one of the more unique books that I have read. And if I just show you pages at a glance, this is actually poetry written from the perspective of a widower and his sons after the passing of the mother. And it's very metaphorically capturing grief and what that can feel like. Of course, everyone's experience with it is different. The circumstances surrounding the loss are different. The relationship with the person who has passed is different. So it's a very unique situation, but I feel like nonetheless there's a lot of universal elements to it that we can all relate to. And so if not 100% of this struck a chord with me, there were certainly parts that did. And I think it's such a lovely and, again, unique way of approaching this topic, where grief is essentially personified as this raven. And, or should I say crow? I believe it's a crow. Been a while since I read it, yeah. So you also get the crow's point of view here as well. And so it basically comes and inserts itself into the lives of this man and his sons, and the way they interact with it is different, and he stays with them until they've gotten to a point where they've turned a corner and start processing and moving on, and then the crow accordingly can move on. But quite abstract, quite gritty, quite raw. It's really something else, because I think, you know, grief is such a messy, illogical thing. Contrary to the stages of grief we always hear about, it doesn't follow a sequential order. It's certainly not a linear thing. And like I said, it's certainly not the same for everyone. And it is something that can just like burrow in and split you apart in different ways. And it's sort of when you're trying to pick up the pieces of that fragmented sense of self and bring it all together again and try to make sense of what your life is now, that it has this absence in it and what your life is supposed to look like going forward. I mean, it almost seems like the only way you can actually express the feeling of that is poetry, and just the fractiousness of that. And how the poems are presented are visually and rhythmically different, and yeah, quite an accomplishment here. So I thought that was very cool. So getting to another book that had been on my shelf for a while, Going Neglected, Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. Oh my God, this was really cool. It involves time travel. It was written in the 70s, and its present day portion is in 1976. But the protagonist, for inexplicable reasons, time slips into pre-Civil War era Maryland, even though she's living in 1976 California. So she is African American. So as you can imagine, slipping into this time period in a slave state, pretty dangerous for her. And she's well aware of the dangers that can and do befall her when she's there, and she's transported back and forth, and it's kind of hard to predict when she will and how long she's going to be in either given place for a time. It's largely contingent on whether she feels afraid for her life. Unfortunately, that tends to be the moment when she's plucked out of one time and put in another, or when this ancestor of hers, who ends up actually being a slave owner's son, when she didn't realize she had any white ancestry in her lineage, when his life is in danger, seems to be what yanks her back in time. And then when she is fearing for her life in the past, she comes back to the future. She first meets this ancestor when he's a boy, but he is older every time she goes back. And the relationship that they form changes over the course of this, of course, where he goes from this more open-minded boy to kind of following his father's footsteps the older that he gets. And so that becomes a lot more complicated and dangerous for her, as you can imagine. But then when she goes back to her own time, she could have spent months in the past, but it'll only feel like a few seconds or maybe minutes in the present. So that adds to a lot of disorientation. But anyway, I had never read anything by Octavia Butler before, and I was really compelled by her writing. She has a very straightforward, sparse writing style, but not in the way, though, of the Diary of the Death Doula that makes it uninteresting. It's really engaging, very intelligent and clever, and it's remarkable to me how vividly she is able to build this world and draw you right into it without the extra fluff of like bogging you down in too much descriptive detail or like flowery prose. Like it's very absent that every word matters in that respect. It's not, nothing feels extraneous. Looking at you, Doris Lessing. I feel like I have to go back to this and say Doris Lessing does have an absolutely beautiful writing style. So I want to give credit where it's due. I'm not saying I don't like her as an author. I'm just saying I didn't like that book. But Octavia Butler, it's just, I don't know how to describe it other than the way that I have. She is able to tell a wonderfully rich and complicated story in a very sparing style, and that's just such great talent to me. I really am interested in reading more by her. I was just absolutely captivated. I read every word of front and back matter because when I finished, I just didn't want to be finished with it yet, and I tried to hold on to it as long as I could, and I think it's one that I would reread again. So highly recommend Kindred. Now, I was reading Kindred while out of town one weekend, and I was staying at an Airbnb that had several books on the bookshelf that you could tell were left by previous tourists that had been in and out of there. A lot of German texts, so apparently Germans love Majorca. But of the English titles, I was looking through them and I found another book since I was so, like, my mind was so in this world that Octavia Butler had created. I saw another book that was set pre-Civil War in the US. It was Tracy Chevalier, The Last Runaway. And this book is written through the point of view of a British Quaker who emigrates to the US in the 1850s with her sister to start a new life in America, and kind of stumbles into the Underground Railroad and becomes a part of it herself, as she's also trying to live by her Quaker values and get on with the Quaker community. Well, I mean, she is living her Quaker values by assisting with the railroad, but to be in keeping with the expectations of her Quaker community actually butts up against that a bit. So this was very interesting from the standpoint of I didn't know a lot about Quakers, particularly of this time period, and living very strictly according to that code. Never once considered what Quakers were up to, during the pre-Civil War era did not realize that they did play a role in abolitionism because they believe in the equality of mankind. And so that was definitely intriguing to learn a bit more of by virtue of historical fiction. You also learn a lot about quilting in the process. Hence why we see the scissor and thread there. And Tracy Chevalier, I first read Girl with the Pearl Earring by her and enjoyed that very much. I liked the movie that was made of it as well with Scarlett Johansson and Colin Firth. She's a great writer. I mean, she definitely does her research, and she has a beautiful style, and the pacing of it just moves right along. That it makes for a very like fluid and fast read, and so I very much enjoyed the reading experience of it, I will say. But that being said, like by the time I finished it, my ultimate feelings towards it were like, yeah, it was all right. I think it was probably unfair that I had read this before this, because this just had so much more of an impact. This was just so much more raw and getting more from the point of view of the slaves and just being written through the eyes of an African American author, and you know what her family and ancestral lineage would have experienced. I just felt like it was truer coming from that voice than perhaps this, with not just a white author, but then, you know, further diluted through this white protagonist, this Quaker, who whose heart's in the right place, but, you know, perhaps also from a naive place, where the protagonist here, she was so smart and crafty and not kidding herself about anything. I mean, you could pretty well expect just how bad things would be, and I don't know, it just hit harder, and I believed in it more. Where this just felt maybe a little more romanticized, but I'll still read more by that author, certainly. Next up was The King's General by Daphne du Maurier, another book that's been sitting on my shelf for quite a while. I went out to Cornwall, kind of taking myself on a little writerly retreat, not for a workshop or anything. I just wanted to venture out to the country, specifically the area of the country where Daphne du Maurier herself lived, and go on hikes and just carve out some space to hopefully get inspired to write. And I did do some writing, but I did a lot more hiking. It really is so beautiful, and I hiked near where Daphne du Maurier lived at the Menabille Estate, and that is the setting of the majority of this novel. So I had picked this up at that time, inspired by a grisly discovery in the 19th century. So basically this estate where she lived, owners prior to her and her husband had discovered a skeleton in a hidden room that had otherwise been sealed off, and it was found in the course of renovations. So I think Daphne likes a grisly discovery. She weaves an interesting tale. Her books are just so wonderfully gothic and spooky, even if they're not, paranormal in any way. Although she did write one involving time travel, The House on the Strand, which was really cool. But Rebecca reads like a ghost story, but there is no actual ghost involved. It's just the ghost of a person figuratively that lives through memory, and if they're talked about, how this person who's not there can still be so present. In this case, this book, it does move around to different estates, but it's largely centered in this estate in Cornwall near Foy, set during the 17th century, during England's Civil War between the king and Parliament. So the protagonist of this novel is in love with the king's general, and she herself, on the verge of marrying him, has an unfortunate accident that paralyzes her from the waist down. So that changes the entire trajectory of her life. Their romance included. And anyway, they managed to stay in each other's lives ultimately, but he's largely away at war, and she can't go anywhere really. She just needs to be in whatever home is safe at the time when not overtaken by the anti-royalists. So it's interesting how she is able, in her seemingly limited state, to still be quite instrumental in some of the events that go down over the course of this, where you're seeing people who are having to leave their homes. At one point, there's a lot of them, including her, brought together in this one particular estate. And, you know, kind of an interesting cast of characters during those times. And then you see what they have to endure as they still have luxuries at their disposal, and when they're stripped of everything. Anyway, it's really hard to describe what it's actually about, because it is just more of a character-driven story, and that's the kind I tend to like the most. One thing that did get tedious about this, though, was when there was just a lot of description of the war, because you're not really like there in the action. It's described secondhand. It's either someone who was there coming back and talking about it, or it's summed up in the narrative, and not something that our heroine has witnessed directly, obviously. So in that respect, that it got a little bit more textbooky, I guess, as it's following what the different campaigns would have been, and the victories and the losses and the advances and the retreats and the re-strategizing and so on and so forth. And so you do get a bit of a history lesson. I guess it's quite valuable in that respect, but I just I kind of found my interest waning when it came to that bit, because I don't have the best brain for recalling like dates and names and places and keeping it straight, and there was like so much having to keep straight with that here, that I just kind of like, it becomes like Charlie Brown's teacher, wah, 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 as my mind kind of drifts. But whenever it came back to the characters that are together in whichever home du jour they find themselves, those were my favorite bits, obviously, and seeing those interactions and, you know, just the strains of the interpersonal relationships that existed before the war, but then, of course, how those tensions are heightened because of everything that's just going on politically. And, oh, Du Maurier has such a gift for description, for setting a scene, and you know that she loves this region so, so much, and I love it so much that it just takes me there through her work. And again, she's got that sort of spooky gothic quality that she brings to everything that it just really appeals to me. So this was great. I finished that one also while out of town. So since I didn't have another book immediately at my disposal that I would have chosen for myself, I started reading one that my mother-in-law had given me for Christmas, which It's another historical fiction in another country following its own civil war. 1,000 White Women, the Journals of Maydad. And it's written as if this was a real person and these journals were really discovered and shared, but it is entirely a work of fiction based on an entirely fictional event in US history. So it's set in 1875. What it was based on, that was true, as the author states in a note at the front of the book. In 1854, at a peace conference at Fort Laramie, a prominent Northern Cheyenne chief requested of the U.S. Army authorities the gift of 1,000 white women as brides for his young warriors, because theirs is a matrilineal society in which all children born belong to their mother's tribe. This seemed to the Cheyennes to be the perfect means of assimilation into the white man's world, a terrifying new world that even as early as 1854, the Native Americans clearly recognized held no place for them. Needless to say, the Cheyennes' request was not well received by the white authorities. The peace conference collapsed, the Cheyennes went home, and of course the white women did not come. In this novel, they do. So, spectacular premise for a book. Definitely intrigued by that. I don't read a lot of Westerns. I feel like the last time I would have been back in grad school, where I read some Willa Cather, like Oh Pioneers and My Antonia. One thing that had me kind of wary from the start, though, and I feel terrible saying this, because writers ultimately do have to write what they don't know at some point. I mean, obviously, it's more authentic when we're writing from our own perspectives, but, you know, at some point you've got to write about an existence that you would not have lived. I mean, especially if it's fiction, it's not going to be all taken from details of your own life, and you're not going to always know exactly what it would be like to live as someone of another gender or race or socioeconomic spectrum or nationality or time period, so on and so forth. So it's like at some point you do just have to like do your best. Do your research and then do your best with that. So it's not to fault that this is a female protagonist written by a man. That happens all the time. But I guess in this context, though, I guess I was constantly reminded that this was written by a man. There are just certain things that happen and certain attitudes that the women have. And boy, the way that they're able to jump back and rebound from trauma is really remarkable. And I just feel like, yeah, that would be explored a bit more by a woman if she had written it. So there are just certain things, I mean, bless them for trying. I think that this was also probably very well researched in terms of some tribal custom and conflicts that occurred. So I definitely found it so interesting. It took me to a different place. I loved exploring this wild and open Western landscape through this. I loved learning some of these customs, as these women were indeed traded for horses with this tribe. Not all 1,000. They started with a preliminary, I think maybe like about 50 or a little under were offered up first to marry and then have children with the men of this tribe. The government does say no to the idea, but then proceeds to go along with it secretly. So it's almost like these women are being sent on a confidential mission, and they are recruited from prisons and asylums and those who are just volunteering themselves, figuring, hey, it can't be any worse than the life I'm already living. So it's an interesting and eclectic cast of characters that we meet through this. A bit stereotypical. they're of different nationalities and regions of the US, and I don't know, it's a little cutesy how like the Irish women are depicted and the Southern Belle, and so again we're just felt like, well, I don't know, like in the Readers Club addendum to this, it makes it sound like people actually finished this and think that this was real. And I mean, I'm just saying, like, at no point of this did I ever think it was real, even if I hadn't read the author's note saying as much. You just kind of like bump against certain things like that you're like, okay. And I don't know. It was written again, like with Tracy Chevalier's. It's like, it's a very like fluid, free-flowing, fast-reading pace to it that, you know, makes the experience of it, I think, very enjoyable and just moving right along. And so I really appreciate that these types of books of the best-selling variety do tend to be very smooth reading, but then there is something in the way that they're told sometimes where, I don't know, as an editor, I couldn't help but be like, that's a redundancy I would have yanked out. Yeah, as far as the redundancy goes, it seemed to happen time and again where something that was very easily implied, it was shown. It didn't need to be told. It'd be shown and then told after the fact. And so it would feel kind of dumbed down in that respect, where it's like, okay, I got what you were trying to say more suggestively. So then like being clobbered on the head with it to follow that, I just kind of felt like it was insulting my intelligence. So just, I don't know, I guess that was an aspect of it too. But anyway, it makes me want to read more of this genre, and certainly something that would feel more authentic, because there's no question that like the subject matter and the setting was fascinating. I just don't think this one quite nailed it, but I wouldn't not recommend it. I read it and I enjoyed every moment that I was reading of it, I'll be honest. And is that not part of the reading experience? I mean, we can get into like our literary critiques as we will, but there has to be something to be said for what the actual experience was. And can't deny I enjoyed it. As opposed to this. What I'm also currently enjoying is The Haunting Season. This is an anthology of ghostly tales for long winter nights. And I picked this up maybe a couple of years ago. I had read the first story of it, and then it just got shelved for whatever reason, probably because other people were giving me books and I was reading that instead. But I have picked this back up and just kind of taking it one story at a time. They're all that perfect length where you can read one in one sitting, and so I feel like I can read one and then put it away and then concurrently begin this book, which was a recommendation from a friend, and I wouldn't have gotten it and I wouldn't be reading it if I wasn't myself super excited too. This is like, I'm all about it. It sounds so great. Mallory is delighted to have a new job looking after gorgeous 5-year-old Teddy. She's been sober for a year and a half, and she's sure her new nannying role in the affluent suburbs will help keep her on the straight and narrow. That is, until Teddy starts to draw disturbing pictures of his imaginary friend Anya. It is quite clear to Mallory and to Teddy's parents, even in his crude childlike style, that the woman Teddy is drawing in his pictures is dead. Teddy's crayons are confiscated and his paper locked away, but the drawings somehow keep coming, telling a frightening story of a woman murdered, and they're getting more sophisticated. But if Teddy isn't drawing the pictures anymore, who is, and what are they trying to tell Mallory about her new home? There's a quote from Stephen King on the front that says, "I loved it. The surprise is really surprise, and it has that hard to achieve propulsiveness that won't let you pull it down." So I'm in the mood for something like that right now. Like I said, I tend to favor like the character driven and the slow going, where it's like it does slow the pace a bit and you can just like live in a world for a while, and maybe the writing isn't as free flowing, but just gives you a lot to chew on. I really do love that, but right now I'm interested in like a quick spooky read, and I think this is going to deliver on that. And as you can see, perhaps there are actual drawings throughout the book, and I haven't looked at too many of these because I don't want to ruin too much for myself, but I'm really excited to read this. Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. And I think that finally brings this to a close. That was a long ramble, not very well articulated, had lots of thoughts, lots to recall. Some of these I just read several months ago, so my brain didn't quite retain all the detail and observations I had about it, but I mean, that in a nutshell captures my impressions of each book. And yeah, I think of the stack, there's only one, arguably two, that I wouldn't read had I to do it over. And I'm sure you can probably guess which those would be. So I'll leave it at that. Anyways, thanks for hearing all this out. Please let me know in the comments what you have been reading. Is there something that you recommend? Is there anything that you recommend I stay clear of? I would love to hear about it. Don't think that I'm trying to deter recommendations, not by any means. I'm just trying to play catch up with books that I already have, that's all. And I feel overwhelmed if I get more. I'm trying not to buy more. So that's my main point surrounding that. So regardless though, I still am interested in what you're interested in, and that really can be the best way to find out what's out there. So thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you next time when I'm back with, we'll see what that is. 'Tis a mystery. All right then, take care. Bye-bye.